Phillip. So in this video, I'm going to give you another teaching strategy. Now, to be completely honest, this is not a teaching strategy I have tried myself yet. This is something that I got out of this book, Small Teaching by James Lang. It is something, if I ever get to teach a lit class again in the future, which is one of my fondest desires at the moment. If I ever get to teach a lit class again, I will approach this the way that Lang does this, because he introduces this as a strategy for teaching literature. But I'm going to talk through it as a way that you could, as a technique that you could use in a rhetoric and composition class. So basically, this is about helping students practice writing thesis statements, and it's a mix and match thesis idea. So basically what happens is, up on the board, or your whiteboard, chalkboard, whatever it is, or in principle you could do this electronically. If you're doing asynchronous, this may be a little bit more challenging, but there's still, I think, a way you can do it, and I'll come back to that at the end. If you're doing this synchronously, there are, I think, digital programs where you can basically have a sort of whiteboard setup. But I actually don't know that much about them, I'll be honest. But basically, on the board, you create two columns. One is themes. For the literature class, this is themes. What you could do for rhetcomp would be put, say, the rhetorical appeals, or rhetorical methods of development, or something like this. Some rhetorical technique or strategy that your students have learned about. And then in the second column, you put the names of the texts that you've been reading for the semester. You may want to particularly focus on more recent ones. And then what you can do is you would have one student come up to the board and circle two rhetorical techniques. And then another student comes up and circles the title of one of the pieces that you've been reading. And then everybody in class has to write a thesis about how that text utilizes the two rhetorical techniques. Or you can do this in a comparative way, which I actually think makes more sense for a rhetcomp class, where you would have one student come up and select one of the rhetorical techniques, and then one student come up and select two texts. And they have to write a comparative thesis about how those two texts utilize that rhetorical technique. So compare and contrast, something like this. And the goal here is that you give students the pieces that they need to put together a thesis. You give them the subject, you give them the topic, whatever it is, and then they just have to figure out how to make an argument about it. So in this case, it takes a portion of the pressure off of students for figuring out what they would want to write about. And they can practice writing these thesis statements based on these materials, again, rather than having to think through for themselves and come up with a potential thesis. And then after that, there's any number of things you can do. You can have them revise these thesis statements later on. You can put some of them up on the board or something like that and talk through them, whatever you want to do. Any of the things that you might do if you follow up a thesis generating activity. Now, if you wanted to do this in an asynchronous online class, one where you're not sort of directly teaching lessons, but using discussion forums or whatever it is, there's a couple of ways that I could think of that you could do this. One would be, you can create the two charts and then just tell each student to choose for themselves, say, one rhetorical technique and two texts. You can do that. Another approach that you could take, depending on how much you want them to sort of interact with one another, is you could choose one student volunteer to choose the technique and a second student volunteer to choose the texts, and then have everybody again write about the same thing, which in some ways is a better technique for preserving that original style of this activity. Or the other thing you could conceptually do, you could actually do that through something like Google Docs. Because in Google Docs, you can allow a large number of people to write on and edit a document. And so in that case, you could actually have several people, and this would work a little bit better, I think, if you tried to do it synchronously, but you could have a number of rounds where you have different students choosing different aspects or something like that. I think this is probably, I will say this by way of sort of following up all of what I just said. I do think this is an activity that works better synchronously. I think it loses something when you try and do this asynchronously. So either in a physical classroom where you can have students actually come up and mark stuff on the board, or if you do synchronous online teaching where you can have everybody sort of share an online version of a chalkboard or something like that. I think that's going to make a lot more sense for this activity.